So welcome again, everyone, to our class. This is our second class in our Sustainable Yard Care series, and this one is all about using native plants in your landscape. And we clearly know that people are joining us from all over. So what is native to us in Western King County may not be native to where you are specifically, but there is a lot of crossover with plants. And this presentation in particular will give you a lot of great general information about using native plants no matter where you are. So it should be relevant to everyone. Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kristen Covey, and I am an educator with the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. I am the facilitator of these classes and kind of the behind the scenes prep person and communicator with everybody. I'm not the presenter today, so we have one person presenting this class, and it's Monica Vanderveeren with the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. And she has been a cornerstone of this series. She's been with us since the first year and has a wealth of knowledge on many of these sustainable landscape topics. And we also have David Jackson with the Snohomish Conservation District joining us. He is the Community Conservation Program Manager there. And he presented at our first class on soil, compost, and mulch. But today his responsibility is to manage the chat box with all of your questions. So good luck, David. This class is being recorded, which means that it will be available for you to view later. So if you'd rather just kind of relax and not worry about taking notes, you can, it's fine. And you'll be able to view this recording online later on. So I will be emailing out to everyone the PDF version of all these slides, and also helpful resources that you should be able to use later on. And then in about a week, we'll be able to send you the link of this recording once it's ready to go. Just a reminder, this class and this series is best suited for people that are newer to yard care and gardening. Just, to provide some really helpful, motivating information to get started. But a lot of the resources that we provide will give you a deeper dive on all these topics. So if you're someone that's a little more seasoned, I still think these classes will be relevant for you. Okay, so hopefully I can do this. Last class, I asked a polling question. I'm gonna do it one more time because we have a lot of people here today. So I'm just curious who is new to these classes and who has been with us in the past. So I'm going to launch this poll. You don't have to opt in, it's optional and it's anonymous. But if you were here at our last class, then you are not new. But I would just like to know kind of the breakdown of folks in the audience. Okay, people are answering. Great, great. Polls are fun. Oh yeah, there is an option for not sure, can't remember, which I totally understand because it's been a long time since we've offered these classes. Okay. I'm going to close the poll in 3 seconds, 2, 1. Okay. Wow. So I'm going to share these results. So we have about 74% of people in the audience that are new. Welcome. Woohoo. Great. We're really happy to have you. For those of you that are new, I would like to provide just a little bit of background for you, and apologies to those of you who have heard this before. But this series is brought to you by a partnership between the King County Wastewater Treatment Division and the Snohomish Conservation District. And this is our 7th year offering this series. And we've been able to expand and grow it over time, and especially in the last 2 years, thanks to COVID and going online. And it's great because we have been able to reach a lot more people from all over with these online platforms. But in the past, we did used to gather together at one of our wastewater treatment plants called Brightwater. And there is an education center located at that treatment plant, which is what this photo is showing you in the middle of the slide. And this particular treatment plant is actually located just across the King County line in Snohomish County, which is what this map on the left is showing you. which is why it makes perfect sense for us to partner with the Snohomish Conservation District, because not only do we share an interest in improving water quality, but we also share some community members. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the box on the right-hand side of this slide. This is showing you the schedule of the upcoming classes we'll be offering in the series. So in general, we'll be doing them every Saturday from now until February 12th, and they will all start at 10 a.m. and go until 11:30. So we would love for you to join us for the future classes. And just a quick word on our agency, the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. So we treat wastewater for everyone that lives in our service area. And there's a map on the bottom right corner of the slide showing you our service area. It's very large. There's about 1.8 million people in the service area, and it's located in Western King County and also Southwest Snohomish County. And obviously, you know, cleaning wastewater is a huge part of what we do, but we also provide educational opportunities and support to the communities we serve. So we offer these free classes to promote a healthy environment, but we also have a pretty robust school program for 4th through 12th graders. And also we do family programs and community events, you know, on the weekends pre-COVID. But yeah, we have a lot of stuff going on at our education center. Okay, and then finally, I just want to go over a couple logistics for this class. So we will primarily be using the chat box for communicating. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box during Monica's presentation, and David will do his best to answer them as they come in. However, we hope to leave about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this presentation for more questions, and we will also address anything we weren't able to answer in the chat box during the presentation. Also, if the chat box is not easy for you to use, I totally understand. So after the presentation, you can definitely use the raise hand feature, which is at the bottom under the reactions icon. So you can click on that, and then we'll be able to listen to your question being asked verbally. Okay, I think that is all I have. I am going to pass it over to Monica. I will be running her slides for her, but she will be doing this presentation. And then just a reminder to make sure everyone is on mute. Okay, here we go.
And David, just a heads up, I've been continually admitting people, which is really exhilarating that they keep arriving. So you'll want to watch the admit.
And I can do it too.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I've been letting folks in as well. There's a lot of you.
I cannot tell you how excited I am. I would rather see you in person, but it's not possible when you're in Nova Scotia. And okay, I am Monica Vanderveer, and I'm going to start again. And welcome. I am so thrilled that there are so many people here, and I hope that everybody gets something out of this. So this is what we used to look like in a classroom. This is David and I giving actually the first talk of the series, which is actually now recorded. Somebody else from this conservation district, Kari, and I did a recording of this, so it's online. I appreciate everybody being here, and what we've done since we're remote is really try to shape these presentations so that they're applicable really no matter where you're from. We have somebody from the UK. That's so exciting. So I'm trying to make this as broadly applicable as possible. We do want you to ask lots of questions of David. David is spending his Saturday with us. He's sharp, he knows a lot, he's got a lot of resources, and he has Google at his fingertips. So ask him a lot of questions. You're not going to actually distract me if you continue to ask questions and chat along the way. So what we'll cover today is really, I want to go over why we talk about native plants. It seems kind of odd, like there's all sorts of plants in the world. Why have a whole topic on native plants? And then why native plants in your garden? Then we'll talk about some native plants for your garden. There's tons and tons and tons in our area. And then kind of go over where to find plants and plant them. David will be talking about the Conservation District plant sale that's coming up soon, which we're all going to be sitting there putting in giant orders for if we're in Washington. And then we've got some resources at the end. Kristen, as she said, will be sending out a lot more resources. And then big kudos to Kristen. She runs this huge series and then just really helps people get all the information they need afterward. You'll also get a PDF of the presentation. Kristen, I did see somebody asked if we could get the chat, and I'd be glad to sit there and edit out the little weird things in it if you want to send the chat out as well.
I can definitely do that.
So just to introduce myself, I actually do public involvement work for King County Wastewater Treatment Division. The reason I'm coming to these classes is because I really like native plants and I plant a lot of them on my property. So this is my property you're looking at. On the left is 2002. I moved in 2000. This is the only house I've ever owned. And then on the right is what it looks like today. And so I have been doing a tremendous amount of planting. I have an acreage, but I also have a house, a yard, and utilities like everybody does. And so I have a lot of different experience. In our area, we will get people who come to these classes who are on teeny tiny postage stamp lots, or they're on gigantic properties. As a volunteer, I've also worked with even apartment buildings to naturalize their balconies and do things like that. So there's a range of what you can do. This is the property I am on. It has a lot of diversity. The exciting thing this morning is I'm on a tidally influenced river and we just got a tsunami alert in Western Washington. So I'm hoping my home's still there when I come back. I'm assuming it will be a non-event. Everybody cross your fingers. So how did I get to the point where I got that many plants on my property? Well, I had native plant stewardship training through the Washington Native Plant Society and Snohomish County, my county. They focus on restoration, which is what I'm doing. I do a lot of reading. I learn from other people. I have spoken to thousands of people as a volunteer, and I listen to other speakers and talk with audiences. I really encourage you to use the chat. People who've got favorite native plants and experiences in growing those native plants, share widely with everybody who is on this call. I do a lot of experimentation. I actually started out not in communications, but as a research scientist. So I have a very experimental approach to things. I've had incredibly profound failures, I will tell you, and some really, oh, there's another tsunami warning. Cross your fingers. But I've had some things work really well and unexpectedly. All of my plants on my property, I'm now at the point where I can propagate some of my own. But every single year I go to Conservation District plant sales, and I've also done plant salvages where we're going to develop properties for home developments and things, and then there'll be an organized, approved plant salvage. And I've gotten a lot of my plants there too. So, and I want to call out the plant at the right is actually the pods of a big leaf lupin and a hummingbird on it. What you will find is my whole motivation, which is why native plants work really well for me, is wildlife. I'm a huge wildlife nut, and I'll be working with the Snohomish Conservation District, partnering to give the next 2 presentations on landscaping for wildlife and living with wildlife. So I always say that I'm kind of on a mission for my wild neighbors to get everybody to plant native plants. So what is native? We should all have kind of a common understanding for our non-US folks. There's probably an equivalent for you in both Canada and the UK. A plant that is the part of the balance of nature. A second, I have to minimize the window. That has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. Only plants found in this country before European settlement are considered to be native to the United States. There is a link here to the National Natural Resources Conservation Service where this definition comes from. They have a lot of resources as well. You'll want to check them out. The plant behind the quote is red flowering currant, which I saw there is. We have a number of people who have it as their favorites, and it's definitely one of mine. So let's talk about why are native plants a topic. We've got a definition. Why talk about this whole group of plants that was here before European settlers? This is another Pacific Northwest native, and it has kind of an obvious name. It's Trillium tri-3, so 3 petals, sepals. And it is one of our beautiful woodland plants. It needs a fairly complex, mature woodland soil to be happy. They have pretty deep roots, so if you're going to transplant them, you have to get the whole root. The interesting thing about these is that they're actually a white flower when they start out. And then after they're pollinated, they turn pink, which it turns up as a signal to pollinators not to waste their time on this flower because it's already done. So to explain why we talk about native plants, I'm going to have you follow me on a brief tour of our local history. For those of you other places, you'll want to look into your own and figure out what the place you're at was in history. The Puget Sound area in the last ice age was sitting under literally a mile of glacial ice. It was just all glaciers in this area, no people. Then the glaciers all melted, leaving deep fjords, that's Puget Sound, and rivers and streams and lowlands. They carved out valleys. And so we had all these different ecosystems, okay, with all sorts of different conditions. So we have a phenomenal number of native plants that lived in this area. Then we have the Cascades, and then in Eastern Washington and in the foothills to the Cascades, we have all sorts of different populations. So this state has an incredibly rich topography, ecosystems, and plant life. And with that, we had very, very rich animal life. Native plants were always the foundation for ecosystems. This is an interesting plant. It's actually a true plant and a flowering plant. It's in the upper right slide and it's called eelgrass. So eelgrass really protects our shorelines from erosion from waves, but it is also the nursery of Puget Sound. All of our forage fish breed in eelgrass. It's an incredibly important ecosystem. And those forage fish are eaten by salmon, which are in the lower right, which are eaten by orcas, which are in the lower left, and by eagles and by people. So eelgrass was really a fundamental, real true plant that was underwater supporting our native peoples. There's a link to this map if you want to explore your area. What it shows is the first peoples that were flourishing in this area. And we had real diversity of people as well as landscapes. You can actually search this to see who the people were in your area. And they were very dependent on the plants, the wildlife, to thrive and survive. So in the Great Plains, I heard an indigenous interpreter describe bison as the Walmart of the prairie, where you could do all your shopping. And the cedar really had a lot of uses here, but we had so much diversity. There was never one Walmart of Puget Sound area. It's just, there was so much available for people to live on. So we talked about the NRCS definition where we said settlers, pre-settlement that we call native. So Europeans in this area showed up in 1792 and recognized it was an incredibly rich area, and settlers followed. There were a lot of resources for them to harvest. There were giant old trees from this area that ended up being shipped to Australia. We actually had coal that was harvested for periods of time. There just was a resource-rich area and settlers came in. Settlers from anywhere always view new lands, kind of like all of us viewed 1970s apartment decor. I know I'm showing my age. It was all avocado green, burnt orange, geometric, right? So we come in and we're like, oh my God, this is the, this is the apartment decor I don't want. I'm going to change it over. And we do the same thing to landscape. The other thing that we do is we, as settlers here, we've wanted to take control of the land. The upper right picture shows what I'm talking about. You see the greenery and behind walls, tiled floors, furniture, and even doors, and a fireplace and an outdoor room. So we really like to control our space, and that affected our native plant populations. What you see in the left picture is a short-eared owl up in the Snohomish Flats area, perched on a property boundary sign. That owl doesn't really care about what landscape is which and what the boundaries are, but we view them as places we need to own and control. And nature behaves differently across the land. The landscape is really designed by wind and water. We see the land more as a checkerboard. So this is a Google Earth view of Charlo, Montana, where the National Bison Range is. And you can see the rivers just kind of winding their way through the landscape. And then what we've done is we've plotted out in geometric forms. So we slice and dice the landscape, and that changes what plants and what ecosystems we have, because we no longer really have a continuity like that river. We start to have a checkerboard effect. The other factor that affects us, our plantings, is marketing, right? So this is the Pacific Northwest Flower and Garden Show. If you've never been, they have some spectacular exhibits here. And to keep the landscape industry going, there's a lot of like changing, kind of like fashion, right? We're all on remote work now, and we've been wearing the same clothes for 2 years. But generally, we'll change up our wardrobe every year, and we kind of want to refresh. And there's a marketing pressure to do that. We also want what other people have. People from all over the world have been shipping things, trading since time immemorial. And we definitely have plant envy. That is a thing, and it affects your local plant populations. So this is a great example. Other people have wanted what we have. This is a castle in France. I was at a conference and traveled with a friend a couple of years ago. So here's a castle in France. And our native Oregon grape and our red flowering currant in their gardens. They were very popular ornamentals, and they have traveled everywhere. So the United Kingdom, my understanding is Pacific rhododendron is now a weed. I'm going to say I don't feel sorry, because we owe them a few weeds back, but it is definitely, it's not always the best thing when you start transporting these plants. And I'm going to talk about in the next slide a good example. So I'm going to give you, anybody in this chat may recognize this plant. Feel free to put the identity in if you know it. If you've done this exercise before, don't cheat. So I'm going to read this. He found it growing on the side of a volcano and planned to use it as a beautiful ornamental plant for residential gardens. This discovery was widely celebrated, so much so that the plant was named the most interesting new ornamental plant of the year by the Society of Agriculture and Horticulture at Utrecht in Holland. So that was the 1800s. This turned out to be Japanese knotweed. And invasive knotweeds are now doing incredible damage. 10 years ago, the figure in Washington state for eradicating knotweed in highway medians was $3 million a year. And they can destroy all sorts of things. So this did affect our local plant populations to have this plant envy and to be shipping things around the world. So another reason that talking about natives is important is really to support your local wildlife. I had an ugly moment this year. I had tried to plant milkweed for monarchs, and I'm like, why am I doing this? We don't have monarchs. And then I looked it up, and it turns out we used to, but we don't have milkweed anymore, so the monarchs are gone. This is a Smithsonian study that actually did a really good job. I was a scientist, so I'm good at being critical of other people's science, but they did a great job of documenting what it took to support suburban bird populations. And what they found is the more non-native plants you had, the fewer backyard birds you had. So what they found is that if about 70% of your yard was native, so it doesn't all have to be native, then you would support backyard birds. And the reason is you're supporting, and this is only birds, so birds are being used as an indicator, but the reason is that you support local insects. So I don't particularly like the idea of eating bugs. I'm very American that way, but bugs are really fatty and have a lot of protein, and they're really, really good for helping hatchlings grow. So on the right is a Bewick's wren with an insect in its mouth, and it's perched on an Oregon grape plant. It had a nest nearby, and so it was harvesting insects out of my landscape and feeding them to its young. So native plants are going to be better for hosting insects that birds will use to feed their young, and it's not just birds. You can actually create a black hole for wildlife, which butterfly bush will do in our area. So butterfly bush can get really, really invasive, and now they're coming up with less invasive species or people deadhead. Here's the problem with it, though. Butterflies require a native host plant to lay their eggs on and for their caterpillars to feed. And they've adapted to certain plants. Butterfly bush is not a host plant for any butterflies. So if you have butterfly bush in your yard and nothing else nearby that they can use as a host plant, they'll lay their eggs on this plant and they will die. So next slide, you effectively become the 1980s horror movie. I'm also showing my age here. This is a spoof of the 1980s horror movies where, you know, there's like the haunted house in the woods and the teens show up. So your next generation shows up and then they all one by one get killed. That's what's happening with butterfly bush in your yard. So this is a quote from that article. When you choose which plants to include in your garden, you're deciding if members of your community's local food web will be nourished or unintentionally starved. That's not something most of us think we're doing when we're planting. This is a woodland skipper on a native Douglas aster. The other cool thing is we think about planting gardens and we're often bringing in agricultural plants. You can actually eat your own landscape with natives, if you didn't realize that. I have given a few talks to the Snohomish County Fruit Society, which is always fun. But you can actually do a lot of harvesting from your own garden, from your own landscape. It's not just berries, but we're showing berries here. There's an article about a juicy guide to berries of the Northwest. In the left is our native salal. It's in berry. They're kind of slightly not super interesting berries, but you can mix them with other tartar berries and jams and sauces, and they're actually really quite good. And they clearly have very abundant berry crops if they're getting even a mild amount of water. On the left is serviceberry or Juneberry. I come from the Midwest, so we called it Juneberry in berry. And then on the lower picture, it's in flower. And the middle picture is black huckleberry or evergreen huckleberry in flower, and hummingbirds love these flowers, these heath family flowers. It has tons of berries. I have enough huckleberry now where I can harvest berries, and black huckleberry here is used actually as an agricultural product. On the right is high bush plant cranberry. You can see the flower and then last year's fruit dry on the stem. Native peoples here would use high bush cranberry, very good source of vitamin C, very tart, but they would make a paste that they would use on all their smoked salmon, which sounds super good. I haven't tried this yet, but it sounds super good. So we have native plants as a topic because native plants have been displaced for various reasons, and they actually provide a lot of value to wildlife and us. It's our natural heritage. And things are changing. So in our areas, since the 90s, native plants have really taken off. They're native plant designers. They have a specialty in native plant design. We have sales. It's really taking off. And if we can keep this going, you know, again, I'm a wildlife lobbyist, then we can have more of our local wildlife. So I didn't want to leave this without giving you some more resources to learn from. The Burke Museum has this excellent webpage on tribal governments, museums, and cultural centers. It is a great place to learn about the First Peoples here and their relationship to the land and the water and the plants. On tribal government pages, I know we're in a pandemic, but when it ends, you can often get links to fairs and festivals where you can go and learn how to do crafts and meet people and learn about culture. It's a really fascinating experience, and I'd strongly encourage you to learn more about the diverse populations of First Peoples who lived in our area. And then if you go to the Burke Museum, which I really love for 1,000 different reasons, the landscaping there is super fascinating. It is all native. If you go onto this webpage, which I've linked to, they have all the plants that are there and they've created some of the landscapes. I might encourage you to think about in your own yard. All these plants are raised at Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center. You can actually volunteer there and take classes there. So I have their link as well. They're a nonprofit, but they harvested seeds so that they had genetic diversity in the landscape that went into the Burke. So it's a really fascinating, I love the Burke. I'm a big natural history, human history buff, but the landscape is really worth walking through. So now let's talk about, we've talked about why we should go native, but let's talk about how we go native. And I wanted to inspire you first with this picture from Washington State University Extension. The first talk we give in this series, which we recorded this year, is always about design. And these are all native plants and this beautiful design that any of us would love to have in our backyard. It's winter time. You can tell that these are deciduous trees, so nothing's in flower yet, but there'll be lots of different flowering plants here. And it has a lot of really lovely design elements. So you can use native plants in really, really elegant yard design. So to start out, when we think about getting native plants for our yard, do know that all natives are not native. So what's happened with marketing, because marketing is marketing, is that the landscape industry has come up with different flavors of native plants, and they're not necessarily going to provide you the same value. So there is a nativar, naturalized, and native alternative, right? So think of it this way. I remember once when trans fats were a big deal, going into the grocery store after backpacking and was really hungry, and you eat a lot of junk food. So I was looking for licorice, and the package of licorice said no trans fats. And I'm like, well, duh, it's licorice. It never had any fat. And by the way, it's not that healthy anyway, but it's a marketing thing. So you need to know whether you're picking a true native or whether you're getting something else. They don't always work for you. They don't work for me well, and I'll show you why if they're not really truly a native. So a lot of times what they're trying to do is change the color so that you get color variety in your yard. And I'm going to argue you can do that actually without doing nativars, but more with different types of native plants. This is an article by National Wildlife Federation that gives you a lot of information about whether they work or not for wildlife. So I did buy blanket flower and some coneflower that were different colors. You see a dahlia, which is a non-native plant with a bee on it. And then those flowers in the foreground. I had an area, I created a garden area after I ripped out a juniper and the plants were on sale. And I thought, well, I'll put them in for this year and see how they do, but I'll wait for the plant sale and replace them next year. So you do see a butterfly sitting on this. This is a red admiral. These are the most territorial butterflies in the world. They will unceremoniously escort you out of their area if you come by, and they're teeny butterflies. But nothing was actually pollinating it. They might as well have been plastic plants. And if you did not realize, there is a trend to make entire yards out of plastic plants. So I put a link at the left. And this woman is sitting in a completely plastic yard. And the link is to the Lazy Gardener's Guide to Faking It. But I didn't have plastic plants. They might as well have been for my goals. So Pacific 9-bark on the right is what our native looks like. And it's got these kind of big flower clusters and maple-like leaves, and it's very green. And then on the left, what you have is called Diablo 9-bark. So they've made a cultivar that has red pigment in it. And here's what National Wildlife Federation talks about. That red pigment actually is toxic to some insects. Okay, so it looks pretty to us, but it's actually not the best for wildlife. So that's where you're making that decision with nativars and native alternatives. You can also get hybridization. Rugosa rose comes from Asia, and it was used a lot here because it's a drought tolerant plant. So they would put it in highway medians, and it's starting to cross with our native roses. So we did talk about only needing 70% native plants. So it's not that you have to have a whole native yard to have a great yard, and you can add some variety. They may not even be native to your area. The coneflower that's shown in the lower left is not native to our area, but I have it. I also have a sedum, that's autumn joy that you see in that picture. Those are great bee plants. You see an open-faced dahlia in the middle of that and it's got bees on it, and a sunflower. Sunflowers can get invasive. They tend not to in my area. Dahlias cannot take off in our area because they hate it wet, and we are soggy here. So they're never going to take over the planet. On the upper right, you see some big rhododendrons that are actually too close to my house. They shouldn't be that close. But those are great bee plants. I walk by those plants and it's just buzzing all the time that they're in flower. So I do keep some of these because they have value, and sometimes they're flowering at seasons of the year where we really don't have any natives flowering. So let's talk about some native plants for your space. There's so many native plants, I cannot cover them all. And I do want to cover some myths. The plant that is behind this image, which is also in the title slide, is salmonberry. And it is a plant you should understand well. I love it, and I plant salmonberry, but it grows very differently in different conditions, and I'll talk about that. So there is a myth that natives only go in kind of naturalized, not nice, not formal gardens. You can put them in any garden. You can put them in formal Japanese landscaping. These two images are from the property of Russell Link, who I have permission to use them. He wrote the Landscaping and Living with Wildlife books from Fish and Wildlife. I think they're out of print, but you can get them used, and I use them as almost a Bible for my planting. But he has done so many different types of gardens on his property, and they all fit incredibly well. And so don't feel like natives aren't going to work for a nice yard or a formal yard. There's also a myth that you can't prune native plants. Absolutely not true. On the left is a deer. I'm starting to get deer swimming across from the EB Island. Not sure why that's happening. And I have a lot of native plants, and what they do is they actually, because I have a lot of native plants, they're preferentially pruning those and not coming to my yard or my garden, which is really good for me. But they've herbivores. We would have had a ton of deer and elk. We may have had moose. They're in northeastern Washington, but there've been a lot of things pruning native plants, and sometimes they actually look nicer if they're pruned. There's an article from California Native Plant Society that I linked on the right. And then we are very fortunate in our area. We have plant amnesty. They started, it's worth going to their website just for a laugh. They started because we had so many horrific pruning things going on in our area to sculpt trees. So they actually have like the shop of horrors on their website, which I welcome you to look at it. The gallery is amazing. Like, why did people put that much effort into ruining a tree or shrub? But they actually provide a lot of pruning advice, and then have very, very inexpensive classes. Again, they're a nonprofit to help people prune properly. So you can prune native plants, and they can help you do this with both natives and non-natives to make your yard look really lovely. So a lot of people think that native plants are weedy looking. I will forever resent Cisco Morris, who's very popular here, and I like Cisco, but he said ocean spray was weedy, and I'm like, it's not. So here are some samples of not weedy looking native plants. Big leaf lupin, which I showed you a hummingbird on the pod at the end. We have a lot of different lupins in Washington State. To the right, we do have an iris cultivar. My mother loved irises, so one of my non-natives are irises. And in front of it is flowering nodding onion, and below that I've got woodland strawberry. In the lower right is Douglas iris. It grows on the east side. It's a little bit more delicate to handle than Oregon iris, which is shown in the lower left. And then in the middle is kinnikinick. It's a ground cover that's used frequently in landscaping. Great hummingbird plant, by the way. And then it has berries for birds. So we've got a lot that are really, really lovely. There is a wrong place for native plants. You do have to do the right plant, right place. I said I experiment a lot, and so you can make mistakes. And the mistake, the picture at the right is my mistake. So I have to thank the Conservation District for giving us this non-native roadie picture on the left overtaking this house. We can all make mistakes with plants, and I have made many. So what I did is I had got a bunch of ferns from a native plant salvage, and I lined a path, but the area where they're planted is an old failed septic drain field, so it's really rich soil, and the ferns are gigantic, and one was growing across the path, so I thought, okay, I should probably get that out. Well, I should probably have moved it 2 years before I did, because it was so giant by the time that I moved it, that what you're seeing is me sitting on my butt on the ground in the mud in the wintertime. I could not lift the plant, so I dug it all out. I rolled it onto a tarp with my legs because I couldn't do it. My back wouldn't have survived it. Then I dragged the tarp across the yard and then rolled it back into a hole on the other side of the yard. It was just this enormous plant. So you really do have to think about the size that they can be and what you need to have. Do you need to maintain your house, or is there a path in the way, or is there a power line overhead? You have to think about that with native plants, just like non-natives. There are plants that you should never plant in a small yard. They're great wildlife plants, and I plant them in the back 40, but you never want them in your yard. So We have everything from drain seekers like willow, which is shown in the lower left. Big leaf maple is terrible for suctioning up water and sewer. It just finds everything in your yard and ruins your pipes. Bitter cherry in the upper left, great wildlife plant. If you have a sunny creek back in the back of your property, put it there. Do not put it in your yard. It really spreads like crazy. And then red elderberry is another one. We've got it in berry and in flower in the two pictures on the upper right. And it's a great wildlife plant, but it gets enormous. It's like a dinosaur-sized plant, and it gets enormous. And those berries are not great to eat raw. So, you know, they look edible. And for kids, you really don't want them picking elderberry and eating it raw. So there are going to be plants you need to think about for whether they really belong in your yard or not. And then the other thing you need to do is talk to native plant folks. We've got a lot of people on here. This is why I encourage use of the chat, because native plant descriptions, they try to give you the best conditions they'll thrive in, but there's some adaptability. So our red flowering currant isn't super adaptable for wet soils. It doesn't like soggy soils. The golden currant is much happier in soggy soils. This is one of my absolute unconditional favorite plants for natives, the Pacific crabapple. And the Pacific crabapple, if you did not know, is being stolen, old Pacific crabapples. People steal them for instrument wood. You can also get permit to harvest, but there's actually theft rings for both big leaf maple and crabapples, which is fascinating to me. But this is an amazing tree. It has these flowers that bloom, very fragrant, very wonderful, and they bloom for a really long time. So I have a crabapple outside my front door, and my whole house is scented with apple for a month in the spring. But it can grow two different ways. So when it's wet, it grows as a short thicket. And when it's dry, like in front of my house, it grows as a tree. And so when we went on remote work, this tree is tall enough, it's as tall as my house, and it's a single trunk tree. Here is a juvenile cedar waxwing eating apples. They're a great fall forage food for birds. And so I'm sitting in my second floor window looking out. So it's not growing as a thicket. And you have to look at what they recommend, but then talk to people and say, is this how it always grows? The salmonberry that was shown in the first slide of this section and in Kristen's title slide is the same way. In the wet and sun, it can grow 15 feet tall into a jungle you need a machete for. In the dry, it can grow very politely. It grows on the top of the dike by my river. And in pots, it can grow really politely. So it just depends on the condition it's in. So there are a lot more myths, and you'll want to check those. I'm big on doing research. I was a geeky scientist, but it helps everybody to do that, and you learn a lot. We used to say this when I was first doing a lot of instruction. It's like, native plants love this area. They love our native soils. Well, here's a news flash. We don't have native soils. When we come in to build housing developments, we actually pull off the topsoil and bring in new soil. We don't have the organisms and the organic matter that we had before. When you do plant salvages, always pick up as much soil on site as you can, because that was native soil, right? For many of us, I'm in an area where it used to be spruce and cedar swamps. We haven't had native soils for 100 years, right? People think that native plants are disease-free. They may have some local diseases they can put up with. We're importing a lot of diseases and pests. So Snohomish County has picked up viburnum leaf beetle, and I'm really struggling to keep my high bush cranberries alive. It comes from Asia, may have come in landscaping plants or pallets or other shipments. And then, as I said, some native plants can get invasive. So it's not that they're always going to be polite in every condition you need them to live in. So let's talk about getting native plants in and doing something fun with them. I want to reassure you, we all have that human tendency to want new things and change and stuff that's not the usual. You can do that with native plants. And you can do that by basically recreating the natural fabric we had, because it was so diverse. So here's an example. If you have a grass is greener urge, try to create another Pacific Northwest ecosystem in your yard. Or if you're from someplace else that has a lot of diversity, create another ecosystem in your yard. There are a ton of online resources to do this. So this is an example from the UW Botanic Gardens, getting started with alpine and rock gardening. And I'm showing two species, the checker lily and the Turk's cap lily, which grow in the mountains and they grow in the lowlands as well. So you can create a cool mountain alpine garden in your yard. And I will tell you the Turk's cap lilies on the right are phenomenal butterfly flowers. So really fun to plant in your garden. There are a ton of resources. These are local for us. For those of you who are elsewhere, I'm hoping you have the richness of resources we do. One of the best for us is Gardening with Native Plants by Art Krukeberg. So he started the Native Plant Society and then had the Krukeberg Botanic Gardens in Shoreline. This guide has been updated with Linda Chalker Scott from UW, and it is phenomenal. And when you read it, it helps you to understand first of all, the breadth and the beauty of the native plants we have. And then Krukeberg was really good at identifying native plants that are really underutilized in gardens. They're aesthetically beautiful, they're easy to care for. So it's a really phenomenal guide. And then April Pettinger, who's, I think she was from BC, she has native plants in the coastal garden, talks about groupings and ecosystems that you can set up in your yard. If you want to have a lot of change, you can actually use a system of pots. I do this a lot, and introduce new plants whenever you can get hold of them. So instead of doing ecosystems, just do color arrangements and things like that in pots and switch them out. And it'll give you that feeling that your yard is changing without really changing the ecosystem value of your yard. So you can create a sunny meadow with a lot of our natives, and I'm going to say Pacific Northwest natives because some of these aren't truly native to our area. Wild bergamot or bee balm is in the upper left. In the middle is California wild lilac. It's a ceanothus. Nodding onion in flower at the right. You see bees on all of those. And then Henderson's checker mallow in the lower left I love it. And you can get it from the Conservation District plant sales. Absolutely phenomenal plant and really great for pollinators. It gives you that kind of English cottage garden look. You can create woodlands. And so you can have trees and understory and have a rich organic layer below there for a lot of our native wildlife. In the upper right, I have actually Oregon iris, which will grow as an understory with dappled sunlight. What's in flower is woodland strawberry, which makes a lovely ground cover. It's also host plant for butterflies. In the lower left, we have as a ground cover woodland sorrel. And then we have maidenhair fern, which is one of our really beautiful, delicate ferns. It's got a black stem and very small leaves, and it's really a gorgeous plant. And then vine maple is growing above it. So that's a great forest understory. We have climbers. So a lot of our most invasive non-native species are in the honeysuckle family. And we have traveler's joy is in the honeysuckle family. And it's horrendous in our area. It's actually the San Juan started clearing it out, the San Juan Islands area, because it was pulling down trees. It grows up into trees and it's so heavy. Our native climbers are not like this. So we have a number of different honeysuckles. I'm just showing two here that are my favorites. And one is twinberry on the top. It literally has twin flowers and twin berries. That is, you will find hummingbirds fighting over twinberries. They absolutely adore it. It is referred to as a twining shrub. You can wrap it around stuff or just, I let mine go wild because I love this plant so much. And I just let them go wild, but you can actually shape them. And then in the lower left is orange trumpet honeysuckle in bloom. And it again is a huge hummingbird favorite. And it's going to grow more vine-like. It's a lightweight vine, so it's not going to tear down your gutters and your trees. But you can actually, again, I'm a little bit casual and I let my stuff go wild, but you can actually train orange trumpet honeysuckle. You can create a sunny forest. So in the upper left is cascara. Cascara is a great yard tree. I have a funny but sad story about it. It started disappearing because the bark was used for over-the-counter laxatives. And so we were taking out so many of these trees that we were losing them. They do have a berry. It's great for birds. Unfortunately, because of the over-counter laxative thing, we had Snohomish County didn't want to put it in schoolyards because they were afraid that teenage girls would start using it to lose weight, which was bizarre to me, but apparently it was a thing. In the right, in a sunny forest, if you're in a coastal area, we have Pacific madrone, which is unfortunately suffering from air pollution and introduced fungus, but it has appealing bark. It is a phenomenal wildlife tree, and it's great in a coastal area. It has very sensitive roots. I tend to accidentally whack it and then kill every one I plant, but and it doesn't like wet feet. But it's a really, really great plant if you have a dry forested area. One of the things that has grown well for me is incense cedar. In the lower left is they're very nice columnar cedars. They're incredibly drought tolerant. They're actually a host plant for butterflies. And so I have planted a lot of incense cedar because unlike our Western red cedar, they tend to stay a little bit more upright. Vine maple is a great wildlife plant for us. It has a samara or seed that has beautiful red color. You can kind of see it in the background. It can get really beautiful fall color if it's in the sun. The thing I really love about our native vine maple as opposed to Japanese maples is it has a really nice branching habitat, and you find birds really like it to perch in and look around for food sources, other birds, predators, this sort of thing. It's a really great native tree. It can get bigger and wider, but you can actually prune it pretty well, and it tolerates a lot of abuse. I had a beaver completely take one down to the ground and it grew back just fine. And then there's a lot of natives and this is just a teeny tiny subset, a lot of natives that can work in a forest understory. So the understory is going to be underneath trees. You see that vine maple in the lower left, it's got sword ferns and deer fern underneath it. In the upper left is, that's false lily of the valley, which makes a great ground cover. And it will come up in kind of moist, shady areas. Our red huckleberry will grow. You see it growing a lot in the woods out of stumps. It does need wood in the soil, some rotting wood and organisms, but it also a great wildlife plant. And then in the right, we have another dogwood bunchberry with the white flowers on it, and you'll get red berries around Christmas. So it's kind of a cool holiday plant. And there's some low Oregon grape in there as well. So you can get a lot of understory plants that can grow up underneath things. I saw somebody say Indian plum was one of their favorite plants. That's in the upper right. What I really love about Indian plum, quite frankly, is pruning it because the leaves have a cucumbery smell that I don't know why I really, really love it. We have our orange trumpet honeysuckle again, second from right. The 9-bark I talked about, and then in the left, we have a dogwood ground cover, shrub and tree. This is the shrub, red twig dogwood. This is another one I would recommend pruning. If you were out at Brightwater, I could show you the ones we have out here. Our gardeners prune it, and the more you prune it, the redder it is. And if you see a whole stand of dogwood during the winter time, it has this brilliant red color, which in the Pacific Northwest, if you're one of our other visitors, you don't maybe know this, we are very gray and very dark in the wintertime. So that color is really, really beautiful. This is one that can double flower. We have a number that will double flower if we get fall rain. So then you suddenly have nectar source for birds in the fall. You can create a camas meadow. The Burke had an example of that. So if you want to have another ecosystem, our native peoples did. The root is quite starchy, and they actually had plots that they farmed, and plots were handed down from family to family. So camas meadows are really cool. So you might have wet places in your yard. I always say don't drain them, enjoy them. You can create ponds and wetlands. This is a marsh wren on a cattail. Cattails are great, by the way, for birds who build nests. So you can actually either replant the area you have if it's wet or create a pond. I'm going to start creating ponds. I've been lazy about providing water because I have a river next to me, but I thought I would like to have a pond and look at my wildlife. So you can create wet places with native plants in your yard. You can protect a coastal bluff. So I talked about our dogwood tree. It's in the bottom. These are very sensitive trees and they are starting to be affected by damage and pollution. Our madrone at left, and at the right is shore pine. So shore pine's pretty adaptable to a number of conditions, but it's a really wind-worthy pine for us. So if you can, I get a ton of wind across my property. And so if you get a lot of wind, they're really good pines to have because they deal with the wind really, really well. So if you're going to create a wet space, you can use some of our native plants. I'm a big fan of spruce sedge. It's in the lower left. It likes kind of wet conditions. It's pretty hardy. It's actually an attractive looking plant in bloom. And then the other thing we have is Miraca Gale. The flowers are in the upper right. They look kind of unimpressive, but butterflies really like them. And Miraca Gale will actually improve, it fixes nitrogen, so it'll improve poor soils. Swamp lantern, it's also called skunk cabbage, but I like swamp lantern. It's one of the first wetland plants to bloom in Washington in the spring. So it's really a nice bright yellow light after long gray winters. You can create stream buffers. We have a number of violets that will work in stream buffers. This is yellow stream violet on the upper right. Nootka rose, it can actually get a little bit invasive in some spaces, so you'll want to be careful where you plant it. We have a number of species of rose, some of which are far less invasive than Nootka, and so you can look at the other species of rose that are available. I talked about red twig dogwood, works really well as a stream buffer, and maidenhair fern. This is a close-up of those black stems and those pretty little leaves in the lower left. I'm sure our visitors from outside the United States are probably unfamiliar with the term hell strip. In our area, the planter strip in the street, which can often be really bad soil, sunny, dry, awful, and then you've got cars whizzing by, that's a hell strip. And they can be planted to be quite beautiful. And in some cities here, or many cities, you're expected to maintain that planter strip. So a lot of the things that would grow happier in Eastern Washington can work really well for those spots. And the right is mock orange, another absolutely stunning plant. It has a huge ornamental value and it smells like citrus and will really spread that citrus scent everywhere. Very, very good butterfly bee plant as well. And here's the California wild lilac. You can see, and I tend to keep my property rougher. You can actually, I've seen a whole hedgerow of this, so you can actually prune it to shape, and then you'll just have this entire purple hedgerow. And it does it's really drought tolerant and does a great job of supporting bees. This is another, just buzzes with bees all spring. To the left of that, you see the big leaf lupin again. So I said, we all like to have a refresh and a change. I'm constantly shifting things around my yard. Not a bad thing to do, but you can do it not necessarily by getting different plants from Asia that may invade, but with our native plants. And so on the left, we have penstemons, superb hummingbird and butterfly and bee plants. And we have 5 different species I think you can get in nurseries. This is the pink is a close-up of Henderson's checker mallow with a bee on it. And then we have a different violet that's next to that, our nodding onion, and then blue-eyed grasses in the lower left. So we have a yellow and blue-eyed grass. They're actually not grasses. They are in the iris family. Great bird plants, and then the blue-eyed grass will have seeds in the fall. I always find songbirds picking around in the pots for seeds there. So they're great plants to grow in pots, and you can move pots around or do hanging baskets or things like that. You might want to create something like a hedgerow. Hedgerows were used as natural fences and buffers in the United Kingdom for a long, long time. They had hedgerows that were hundreds of years old, phenomenal wildlife habitat, and they actually are low maintenance for you. I am growing them to keep my neighbor's cows out because the wood fencing you see in the lower left is effective, but incredibly expensive. And so I'm actually growing hedgerows to try to keep the neighbor's cows out, but they can also be great wildlife buffers, give you flowers and scent, and be a place for pollinators all year long. You can create specialty gardens like hummingbird gardens. This is a close-up of David's penstemon in the left, our salal and flower. There are a number of different hummingbird plants that you can plant if that's your specialty, because a lot of people have specialty gardens. And this is not even a complete list of all the native plants that you can have in your yard to attract hummingbirds. I'm a huge hummingbird fan, as well as butterfly and everything else. And so there just are a ton of different plants that you can plant. There's no shortage for anything you want to make as a specialty wildlife garden. We talked about butterfly gardens and needing host plants. Again, here's our Turk's cap lily in the upper left. Our native red columbine is a great butterfly plant as well. Blanket flower, this is what our native blanket flower looks like. So the showier ones are maybe more impressive, but here I just get woodland skippers all over these in the fall. Sea thrift is in the upper right, very drought tolerant, works well in a rock garden. I introduced you to our Douglas aster and then our lupin again on the bottom. So butterfly gardens, we've got a ton of natives. We have a Washington Butterfly Association that has huge plant lists for you. Sensory gardens are becoming popular. So I kept talking about fragrance because it's very important to me in color and texture. Well, it turns out we're now making something called a sensory garden. And I have linked to an HGTV article with a sensory garden designed to wrap around your patio. You can do some of this stuff in pots too if you only have a patio or you're on a balcony. And so, you know, building a fragrance, color and texture garden, it serves you, it's going to serve wildlife, and there's a lot of natives you can do this with. So that's becoming a trend that you can definitely fit your native plants into. This is our native Oregon iris. It has a variety of colors. I absolutely adore it. You do have to split it. It's pretty hardy. You can beat it up pretty much when you split it, like literally just hatch it apart. And it has abundant seeds. So if you want to share seeds with other people, it works really well as a sharing plant. So how do you find native plants? I'm just about to turn this over to David. He'll talk about the native plant sales. So we have a lot of plant sales in Washington State. Our conservation districts have native plant sales. I will go to 3 conservation district plant sales this year because there were unique things in different districts. We have Native Plant Society chapters in this state. I know they're everywhere. And often with Native Plant Societies, you're finding plant stewards that have unique things that you can't get anyplace else. So I highly recommend if you're into native plants going there. Plus they can help you with gardening advice. So can our master gardeners. We have master gardeners in Washington State. We are starting to get a lot more native plant nurseries. I do shop. I pick a certain amount up from my local garden center. They're more expensive, but I do this deliberately to encourage them to start stocking native plants. So look at your garden centers and encourage them to start stocking native plants. So plant selvages used to be more common here, where they were going to build a development. There would be an organized, with permission of the property owner, they would come in and move everything before the developers showed up. Because what they'll do is bulldoze everything and compost it. So you would harvest for native plant nurseries, for restoration projects, and then get to take some home on your own. So plant salvages, I think, are still happening, but they're a lot less now, and certainly not with COVID at all. Harvesting seeds or plants in the wild in Washington State, you have to have a Department of Natural Resources permit. You can do it. And so I would recommend, if you're interested in doing that, contact Oxbow, look up the regulations, but contact Oxbow and learn how to do that. Or the Native Plant Society can also help you with that. They have helped native plant stewards harvest plants if you are willing to turn some things back over to plant sales. So I'm going to turn this over to David now, and I can start checking the chat to see if there's anything I need to address. And he can talk about the different types of native plant products that are available and the plant sales.
Hi, thanks, Monica. So this will be a very quick overview. The science around nursery production of plants is an entire science and probably an entire lecture in and of itself. So this will be a very quick overview. If you do buy plants from seeds, understand that you're taking a fairly significant risk that they are actually going to grow up into something healthy. The best use of seeds, in our opinion, is for either annuals or things that are going to grow in large amounts. Last week, we talked about trifolium repens, clover. It's a great use of seeds rather than buying individual trifolium repens or clover plants. Live stakes are when you are able to take cuttings of plants and then plant them directly into the ground. Those are plants that are they reproduce vegetatively, meaning those stakes will root and take off. There's also a number of ways to increase the viability of your live stakes. So you want to make sure, one, the plant that you're going to be live staking is able to be live stake and you aren't just putting a stick in the ground. And two, that you have done everything in your power to make sure that those live stakes are going to be as viable as possible. Bare root is often the most common way that you are going to find native plants, and it's the majority of the plants that you get from the plant sale will be bare root. That is the picture that is on the left there. Now, when you get plants from the plant sale, they are packed in sawdust because you don't want those roots to dry out. If the root hairs get access to air, they will dry out, they'll become damaged, the plant will become non-viable. So you want them to stay moist, so you want them packed in some kind of material. Sawdust is the easiest until you get to the point where you're ready to put them directly into the ground. And as soon as you get them in the ground, you also want to water them in. So you get all the soil in, and then you go ahead and put some water on it to make sure that they're good and all the soil is settled around those plants. If you get pots, plugs, or bulb and burlap, you can also bare root them. There's a number of people, including Dr. Scott, who says that you should always bare root native plants in order to avoid a soil root interface issue, which I will not explain right now. Someone's really curious, we can talk about that in the questions, but there's a lot of research that suggests that bare root planting is the best way to get plants in the ground and going viable as soon as possible. I'm sorry, I'm seeing the chat. I noticed that it says that I'm fading in and out. I will try to move closer to my microphone. So if you want to bare root your plugs, pots, or bulb and burlapped plants, all you need is a 5-gallon bucket full of water. Take them, put them in the 5-gallon bucket of water, wash any of the clay, sawdust, or soil off of them, and then put them into the ground bare rooted. Plugs are usually for grasses or small plants. They're about this big, and they are basically highly concentrated roots that you want to separate a little bit before you put them in the ground. Pots are exactly what they sound like. They are the 1 gallon, 5 gallon. Folks, since we're short on time, I'm going to forge ahead. I apologize if you're not able to hear me. If you have any questions about what I've said, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to spend some time with you to kind of talk through this process. But the bottom line is plugs, pots, and burlaps, they're going to come in containers. You'll need to take them out and either prepare them for planting, and you can prepare them either by doing the normal planting from the pots that you're used to, which is making sure that the roots are scarred up in the ground, or you can actually fully bare root them in water. Bulb and burlap, you absolutely have to do that. You need to remove the burlap. They're usually held in clay to protect the roots, and that absolutely has to get off. Your best bet is to plant into that as bare root as possible. So this is coming up very soon. It's the Snohomish Conservation District's annual plant sale. As Monica mentioned, several conservation districts have plant sales. They're usually held at different times of the year. Ours is usually the first. So the pre-orders begin on January 24th. They will run through February 4th. And then in March, the 5th and 6th, you will be able to come by and pick up your plants. We are only doing pre-orders and orders online this year. So we are not going to do any sales in person. This is a COVID safety thing. But also we are not going to do what we did a couple of years ago, where we actually bring plants to you. You have to come get them yourself. If you're not able to come get them yourself, let us know. We will try to arrange another time for you to come get them, but we're not doing the deliveries that we did in a panic back in 2020, unfortunately. The link is there for any more orders. Please order early. We will sell out. We sell out consistently, and people are always very disappointed. Last year, I sent some of my friends and said, oh, by the way, the plant sale's live, like 2 days after. Go grab plants. And I just got a bunch of angry text messages like, David, you told us too late, everything's going. So we've accommodated that. We have a lot of plants, but we will sell out. If you would like to volunteer, we are taking volunteers again. We haven't the last 2 years for safety reasons. But if you are interested in volunteering, we do have a separate link where you can go to the website and click the volunteer link. You must be fully vaccinated. That is a restriction that we are all abiding by. But if you're interested, we are accepting folks back to help us bundle plants.
Okay, so thank you to both Monica and David. Sorry about the audio issue, but we would love to open it up to questions at this point. We've got about 8 minutes left before 11:30. And I know there's been a lot of action happening in the chat box. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to answer all of those quite yet. But I will just turn it over to Monica or David if you are more in tune with what questions need to be answered in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm coming in late, so I'm trying to answer as I go.
Okay.
Monica, we have a couple questions that a few folks have asked about. One is that you mentioned 2 books earlier on in your presentation. Folks wanted to make sure they had the titles of those books. And then a few folks have asked about the plant, a list of plant names, along with the slides that you had up earlier.
Yes, and in fact, if you keep flipping through, and Nicole, why don't we flip through the slides, because we've got the King County Native Plant website and the I'm going to put the book names in, and then we will get you a list of everything that we talked about. So if you want to keep going forward, Kristen, I think you will find both the Native Plant Society and the King County Native Plant website, which are also great guides.
I think it was towards the beginning of the talk.
No, it's at the end.
Well, the question came towards the beginning of your.
Not the book, though. Go to the end, because it's the slides that were at the end.
Okay. Okay. Anyways, we can keep answering other questions.
Okay, so there's the Native Plant Society, and you can find a bunch of plant lists and pictures there. And then all the scientific names. I apologize to anybody who's a purist. I tend to use common names. But it's a great site to find information about native plants and gardening with them there. And then if you want to go to the King County, there you go. So we actually have a native plant guide, and you can look at, again, they're going to have a description for optimal conditions. And so you'll find the common name, the Latin name, where they grow best. Again, I always encourage you to do a little bit of research, because sometimes there's some plasticity in how they'll grow. On the left is Native Plants Pacific Northwest, great guides. And great gardening guide as well. And it has ethnobotany and some, for some of them that are toxic, there's some information there. So let me put this. Gardening with Native Plants of the Pacific Northwest is by Art Krukeberg. It has been updated in the 3rd edition, so look for that, because the first ones are probably out of print. And then it is co-authored in the update with Linda Chalker-Scott. And it is possible that I think the Fish and Wildlife books are out of print, but you can find used copies, and that may be the same case with April Pettinger's. There's a lot of books out there. Those happen to be my favorites. And what's next?
Oh man. Let's see. Any references for reinforcing and maintaining a riverbank in Pacific Coast areas? Oh wait, it looks like David's working on that one.
Yeah, and I did put a link in the presentation that actually, believe it or not, comes from Department of Ecology on coastal restoration, because what they're trying to do is get people to soften coastal buffers so that we don't have these hard buffers that are ruining our eelgrass beds. And so they have a lot of list of plants and actually planting techniques. If you are in a waterfront where you're going to have a potential for erosion. So I've got a link to that earlier in this presentation. You'll see it.
Great.
And then I see, is the King Edward red flowering currant worth planting? I do not know. I tend to go completely native on flowering currant, and I don't know. So it might be something that you'll want to ask. Okay, so Amy has standing water in her yard. What's the best shrub to? You're going to need shrubs that are happy in a lot of water. If you are trying to take up water in the yard, what you're going to want is something evergreen. Okay, and you don't have to have like 150-foot tall Doug fir. You can have something that is a shorter, like a subalpine fir, that's going to be more appropriate for yard. Cascara as a small tree is a really beautiful tree in flower, and it, as I said, it has berries for birds and a nice backyard tree form that also will deal with your water, and they're pretty hardy. And then for rabbit resistant, I see rabbit resistant ground covers, woodland sorrel, they will not touch. Woodland sorrel has that, what is it called? It's a neurotoxin. You can eat small amounts of it, but if you eat too much, it will like paralyze your tongue or something, and they don't seem to ever touch it. It will not, wood sorrel likes it shady, so it will actually curl up and die in the sun. So you'll need to worry about that piece. I do not find rabbits eating my native strawberries. So we have a woodland strawberry, which I showed, and then a coastal strawberry, which does really well in sunny conditions and wet, soggy conditions. And it's got a glossy evergreen leaf. And again, a white, so the coastal strawberry is the basis for all cultivars. It has really teeny berries, but really tasty berries.
Kinnikinnick is another good one.
Yes.
It will grow back very quickly. They tend to leave the leaves alone. They might end up a little bit chewed, but they won't be destroyed, and it grows very, very quickly, and it's very sun tolerant.
So I'll be doing the wildlife classes. You know what's really helped me? Coyotes. We have a pack of coyotes, and I have a lot of cool pictures of coyotes, but they have really crushed the rabbit population. Thank you, coyotes.
If you are in Edmonds or Linwood, you have a prolific rabbit issue. The best thing that I can say is polls for raptors, like eagles and things, and then beg your neighbors to stop releasing their pets, because I guarantee you those are not native rabbits. They're somebody's pets that got out and fell in love.
All right, I wanted to go back. I know we only have a minute. There was a question I think that got buried about this, and it might just be providing a reference, but or resource. Are there any native plant recommendations for a balcony or pots for sunny or shade?
I did put some in there. There are tons for balconies and pots. And what I will do, because everybody's asking for a list from this, is I'll separate out. I'll just add on to there what would work well on balconies and pots. I did a whole, when I was working with National Wildlife Federation as volunteer, we did a whole apartment building as hummingbird gardens on balconies. It was stunning, and it was so successful. So I will send a list.
Awesome.
I put a short list in the chat. I think Kristen, I accidentally gave it to the waiting room because I'm an idiot, and Kristen put it in the chat.
Easy mistake.
I'll give you a good list for pots, because that also works for people who just have patios and not very much lawn space and utilities in the way. So,
Monica, I did that twice, and apparently my microphone is still broken. So you're doing a lot better than I am.
Technology. I love the audience size we get at this and the technology. So what do our frogs like? What are frogs like in the Pacific Northwest, and everybody has like spring peeper type frogs, is mulch. Deep, very deep, woody kind of mulch. So like I leave my fern fronds to just kind of melt in the soil. They want a cool, dark place to be. And actually Pacific chorus frogs they reproduce in water bodies, but they actually spend the summer buried in mulch. So make sure that you have I think we had our soil class already, but soil and mulch is like a really big wildlife benefit. Does cascara has thorns? No, don't ask me why it's called that. It does not. So Pacific crabapple has a spur, not a thorn, and it's actually really good. I have put it around areas, birds like it because cats can't crawl up if you have cat problems in your area. And so I put it around like bird baths, actually.
There was one question. Do you have a reference regarding the toxicity of the 9-bark cultivars Diablo?
Yes, I will put that in. So it was, I didn't realize that reddish pigment was an issue. So I will, full disclosure, tell you I bought it because I was like, oh, it'd be cool to have red. I'm a human being like everybody else. I do the same thing in my yard. And you can look at that. National Wildlife Federation talks about pigments that create, there's a link to their blog article in this presentation, which Kristen will be sending you. They talk about the various things that are really bad for wildlife. But yeah, I bought Diablo 9-bark going, oh, cool, it'll be a different color. I will fully confess that at one point I bought an on sale plant that turned up to be a red version of knotweed. And then it had like the burn festival getting rid of it. So yeah, I have a link for that. And that's when I started to get really aware of what is native and not. And it's sometimes hard to tell. So I bought some coastal strawberry on sale in the store, and it just had the scientific name and it didn't have a variety. And then when it bloomed pink. And I thought, this is not coastal strawberry as I know coastal strawberry. And then it actually started to hybridize with my native coastal strawberry that I already had. And I was so upset. So it's just really sourcing your plants. If you care about native plants, really sourcing your plants is important.
Great. Okay, I want to acknowledge the time and close the class. So I have a slide up showing you the upcoming classes we'll be having for the rest of the series. And the next 2 classes are going to be focused on wildlife. So if that is something you're passionate about, I would suggest you join us for those 2. Monica and Sarah from the Snohomish Conservation District will be doing both of those classes. We also have one on sustainable food gardening. And the last one is all about being a good water steward, how to manage the water on your property properly. So thank you all for being here, for all of the great questions. I hope this was helpful. And again, I will be sending out an email shortly with some more resources and the slides from today. And then in about a week, I'll be able to give you the link for this recording of the class. It does take a little bit of time to get it posted. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. And thank you again to Monica and David for everything you've done to make this class successful. So have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.